joined by my partner Brandon Averill. Today,
Disclaimer: Eric Averill and Brandon Averill are the co-founders of AWM Capital. Due to industry regulations, it's essential to explicitly state that investment or strategies mentioned on this podcast may not be suitable for you, and you should discuss your specific situation with a qualified, certified financial planner. All opinions expressed by podcast participants are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of AWM Capital or its affiliates. For more information, visit athleteceo.com.
welcome back to the Athlete CEO podcast. I'm your host, Eric Averill. Today is a fun one. I'm joined by my business partner at AWM Capital, Robbie McConchy, and we have an opportunity to sit down with Neil Jones, the owner of Quantum Helicopters. Neil, thank you for taking time to sit down and chat.
Oh, absolutely. It's a pleasure.
Great. Well, I know Robbie is the one who's had a relationship with you for quite a while and has talked about being able to take a ride in a helicopter and what an experience it was. But just, he loved your story of, really the entrepreneur who hasn't taken the normal path of, going to some Ivy League school, who has mom and dad's, bank account to start a company. And so I think our listeners are really going to love to hear your journey. And if we could just start there of, how did you first fall in love with helicopters?
Well, as I remember it, Eric, when I was a kid, just in grade school, and I mean really young, maybe 5 or 6 years old, first grade or so, there were a couple of TV shows that had helicopters on them. And I remember the old Batman TV show when I was a kid, and there was another one that I've tried to look it up, in recent years, and that's really what exposed me to helicopters. I didn't have any family. My father was a police officer and in a small town, so there weren't any. I don't even think there was a helicopter in the whole city, in those days. But I got interested by watching television and was really into it, from a very early age, and as I progressed through school and got into junior high, and I kind of forgot about it. I didn't have any way to exercise that interest. I didn't know anybody that had anything to do with aviation, really, in our family circle. So when I had finished my sophomore year in high school, I just had received a driver's license, just learned how to drive. And of course I was looking for a summer job to support the driving habit, and whatever kids are doing in those high school years, and dating and all that. So I'm looking for a summer job, and one of my buddies called me and said, "Hey, at that time the Phoenix area was very agricultural, especially this little suburb that I live in." And one of my buddies called and said, "Hey, these guys that have this crop dusting business out at the Chandler Airport are hiring, and they'll hire young kids as long as you've got a driver's license. It's kind of a grunt job. It's hard work, but just ground crew kind of work. But they'll hire you." So man, I got in my little car, drove out there, and they did hire me. And this particular company was operating both airplanes and helicopters, and it was like the first day that I went out. They actually worked in the nighttime mostly, so it was the first night that we went out to go do the job. They put me on an airplane crew, and by the end of that first night, man, I was just hooked. I mean, I'd listened to one of your other podcasts with the gentleman who was the general manager of the Dodgers. I enjoyed that a lot. And I remember him talking about the passion. You need to have a passion for what you're doing, and man, all of that interest, when I was out there seeing the airplanes fly and saw a couple helicopters come in to the operation that day, I mean, I was just hooked. So all of that interest and plus it was just cool. I was 16 years old.
Yeah.
And I like cars and machinery. So that really, that first night out, I came home that night or the next morning when we finished the job. And I said, I told my dad, who was still a police officer at that time, I said, "Dad, this is this is what I'm going to do. And he's like, yeah, you've said this and you've said that. I said, no, this is my thing. I'm going to become a pilot, and I'm going to do this. And my mom's just kind of shaking her head, yeah, we'll see. And then, but that's what happened. I continued to work there through the rest of high school, and through the few years right after high school to make enough money and to earn enough so that I could pay for my training. And that's how I got started. I started flying airplanes right after that when I was 16, because the civilian helicopter industry at that time was very difficult to break into if you weren't military. And that has really changed now, but in those days it was right as the change was starting to happen. So I started in fixed wing and flying airplanes, but my heart was still really with helicopters. And when I was in my early 20s, I got a chance to jump over to the helicopter market, and it's really been a fun, interesting, sometimes very hard, like most jobs and most companies, most careers, you go through some difficulties, but it's been a wonderful, really fun career. We have met some of the most interesting people in America because of our connection to helicopters, and I'm very, very thankful. I really have enjoyed it. I've been doing it now for 35 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you talk about that passion, and I think it's important to park on there a little bit, because you were in high school, and I think we can all remember back being the high school kids, and for a lot of maybe our athletes that are listening, or for Robbie and I, who with our athletic background, is we did have a focus and a passion on wanting to accomplish a goal, and we had to give up a lot of what maybe normal kids were doing. And we were talking offline, the amount of work that you were doing. We're not talking about flipping burgers at McDonald's for a few hours. You said you were putting in 80, 90 hours of weeks when you're in your teens. And so I just think of that passion, and then for you to save enough of your own money to do your training. A lot of people, think, oh, it's a big jump to college. I look at what you did and go, you actually had a lot more direction than most teenagers. And can you just talk about the work ethic that it took and instilled in you, and really that first mentor you had? You said you learned so much of just being hands on the job.
Yeah, well, that first high school job, and my father was a police officer by trade, but he was a handyman, and he was always a very generous guy, so he was always doing projects and helping neighbors and people at our church. And so my dad was always, in my younger years, dragging us around as his support staff. We would do all of his grunt work while he did the fun stuff. And but he was the example that he set. He was one of the hardest working guys I've ever seen. He provided for his family, and he took care of us, and so I had his influence going into it. And then this job that I took when I was 16, that was really my first job that I had a boss, and I punched a clock, and that job was a difficult. I mean, what we were doing the first couple of years I worked there was washing airplanes and helicopters, and sweeping the hangar, and loading chemicals, and it wasn't glamorous, but I was just in heaven because I was around the aircraft, and I was getting to hang out with the pilots, and that job had an influence on me on so many different levels because of what you said. It wasn't the normal high school job where you work 15 or 20 hours a week at a fast food place. In the summertime, we had the opportunity to work, literally 85, 90 hours a week during the cotton season when these guys were working and busy. So even though we were making low hourly wage, by the time you take the time and a half, and I also learned that, hey, this is how this works. If I go out here and I work hard for these people, they give me money every 2 weeks. And that really resonated with me. I enjoyed working and producing, and even though it wasn't, I would never want to do that job now, it was a wonderful jumping off point for me, not only because I could make more than normal income for a 16, 17, 18-year-old to try to finance my flying habit, but because the owner of that company, even though he really wasn't into to being a teacher, or he wasn't overtly trying to train me or mentor me, because in my later years that I worked at that company, I got to work directly with the owner, who was a helicopter pilot. I drove his chemical truck, and I was his ground crew, basically. And we'd go out and work long days, and I learned so much from just watching him. The guy, like my dad, he had an incredible work ethic. He could, he was in his 50s then, and he would outwork all of us in our, teens and early 20s. And he was efficient. He was smart. He put the work out. And from working with him day in and day out, I really started to learn about business. Even though he wasn't sitting me down and saying, "Okay, here's how we're going to do it today, Neil, and I want to teach you, the P&L or the balance sheet," or none of that happened. But just watching his example and the way he took care of things, and the way when everybody else wanted to take a day off, the wind would blow, so we'd have to shut down. Everybody else would want to go home. He'd make everybody stay, because he knew if we miss this opportunity to get the work done, we'll never get it. We're going to get backed up for the next several weeks. So, and he also, that was the first time in watching him run his business that I can remember the seed being planted. Hey, I want to be like that guy, and I'd never even really known anybody that had their own business, and I had always thought, I'll train up somewhere and I'll get a career, and maybe I'll be a police officer like my dad. But watching him, the seed was planted that, hey, not only would I like to be him, I might be able to pull that off in some way. And so for all those reasons, that was a great starting job for me, and it allowed me to accelerate my flight training, make a little bit more money. My parents helped me as much as they could, because flying, in the civilian world was very, like it is now, but it was even a little more challenging to get civilian flight training back then. The civilian helicopter world in the early 80s was very new. Up until that time, there really was no civilian training world. Everybody was military. So it was a great job to get me started. That person, if he was to hear this interview, he would probably say, I didn't know I was mentoring. I didn't know I was mentoring that kid, 35 years ago, but he was. And I've learned a lot, so much. I've enjoyed reading some of the Kiyosaki books, Robert Kiyosaki. And one of the terms he uses is work to learn, not so much to earn.
Yeah.
And although I was earning money, so much of my experience in working with people, and especially in my early career, I wasn't very academic. I never really liked school all that much, but I learned from watching other people that I looked up to. And I still do. We have some of the most interesting customers in the world that come through here because of their connection to helicopters, So that's a big part of what floated my boat, and my passion in the aviation world was seeing all these other people, watching them do it and do it successfully. So that's kind of how I jumped into it. And once I jumped in, like I said, I was just, for better or for worse, I might have been able to do better things in my life, but once I got into that exposure to aviation, I was so passionate about it. I never thought about it. I was a one-track mind, for better or for worse. And looking back on it now, 35 years later, I'm very grateful. It's been a wonderful career.
That's great. And I think just hearing you talk about that obsession with being in love with aviation and with helicopters is what created that curiosity for you to pay attention. It's I've had a lot of conversations lately with older gentlemen who've been very successful, and one of the things I thought was interesting is our younger generations, we want the older generation to come tell us, hey, I want to mentor you. But the reality is that generation doesn't use the word mentor.
Right.
They weren't thinking about, hey, can I get some young guy that I can train? Sure, there's the exception to the rule, but I think that's some of the best advice that I've heard and I share with people now is, if you're curious about something, you've got to force your way in. You've got to take advantage of those opportunities when you're with an expert to ask questions, to pay attention, to watch. And if you want to know something, put yourself in that position and play the long game. I don't want to say don't worry about, that your buddies are making more money, but if you're curious about something, like, get into the nitty gritty details. And I think that proves in your story is true as well. And so you finally do get your opportunity to start working in the helicopter space. You go to work for a company that starts in Scottsdale. You shared with us it started as a really small operation, one helicopter, and grew. Tell us about that journey, and specifically what you learned from a business standpoint, watching that growth trajectory and how he handled the business.
Well, yeah, and that was, like everything we do, but especially I think earlier in any of our careers, everything you do is a learning experience. And I was, once I had obtained enough certification and ratings in the FAA world to go out and get a job, an entry-level job. My first entry-level helicopter job was for an operator that was in Scottsdale, Arizona, and they were very small. They were flying these new Robinson Helicopter Company helicopters, and that helicopter ended up really changing the entire civilian industry. It made it possible for people in the civilian world to go out and become professional helicopter pilots like never before. Again, before that, if you wanted to fly helicopters, you almost had to do it in the military. So I was fortunate enough to get a job with this small company, and it was, again, a remarkable learning experience. I mean, I came from a agricultural community, although my dad was in the police field, very conservative, and everything was very carefully planned, to never really knew anybody that had their own business, to going to work for this guy that was totally the opposite. He was a goer and a blower, he was a wheeler and a dealer. And so the two extremes there were very fascinating and sometimes, challenging for me to watch the way he did business, and he was a risk taker, and a lot of that, he did a lot of things incredibly well. I mean, he had started this little company and dealership, and as I went to work for him, he grew into, over about a 6-year period, the biggest civilian helicopter flight school in the world.
Wow.
So, and he was, again, the entrepreneur and the boss and the owner, and he did a lot of those ownership, dream and scheme, the vision kind of things. But what that allowed me to do, I kind of became his right-hand man and ended up being there 8.5 years. I got to, from a first-hand basis, learn the business, because I was the nuts and bolts guy, and setting up the training programs, and setting up programs for the different aircraft that we got into over the years. And he went from at the beginning one small little 2-passenger training aircraft to the end, when all of that came to an end, he had, I think, 23 helicopters. So during that time, again, I was earning. In the beginning, I wasn't earning much. It was, it really was kind of work to learn, but I was learning the business. I was meeting people in our local industry here, and the helicopter business is relatively local. And kept doing that. The business had an incredible growth. We got to do some really fun and interesting things. To be fair, I learned a tremendous amount from that gentleman that I went to work for, a lot of things of how to do things. But I also learned some things that I have chosen not to do, that for me once I started my own business, were not the way to go. And I started meeting customers that I was working with on a day-to-day basis, and many of them that we were teaching to fly were very successful business owners and people that had purchased helicopters, So I was just drinking all that in, asking questions. How'd you do it? What's your story? some of the most fascinating aviation people out there. So that was going great through the late 80s and the early 90s. I was working for this company, had finally gotten to the place where we were making some fairly decent money and thinking that things are starting to pay off, and kind of getting fat, dumb, and happy. And then one day he walked in. I mean, he was a believer in leverage. He used borrowed money to jump into one thing and another, and that was his style. It was his business. But that caught up with him as the savings and loan, problems started to take place in the early 90s. And one day in late 1992, he walked in. We were still the busiest civilian flight school anywhere. And he had a meeting and let us all know that we were unemployed. I mean, in one day, which was probably a blessing in disguise, because you don't have a chance to worry about it.
Yeah.
It's just one day it was over. And I was 30 years old at that time. That was 25 years ago, and I remember just sitting in the panic, thinking, "Oh my gosh, well, what am I going to do?" I got 3 small kids. I had just started construction on a house, and now I'm unemployed. I have a construction loan for my house, but I'm probably not going to get. How am I even going to do that? How am I going to get the final, permanent financing? All that stuff is going through your head. My wife was a school teacher for many years, but she had recently stopped teaching to stay home with our kids. So it was just a mess. But I knew that I had always been dreaming about starting my own business, and I would have never drawn it up that way. I would have done it so much differently. But here I was, and even that was a blessing in disguise. I had to act. I didn't have a choice. I had to either jump in the pool and start flailing around and see if I could swim, or I had to go try to find a job somewhere. Yeah. There was a little bit of an aftermath of some of the customers were still available from the company that had just closed down, and we rallied everybody together that we could and put a small team together, and that was 25 years ago. We started with 2 little tiny training helicopters. And a wing and a prayer, and literally a prayer. Yeah. We did a lot of praying.
Yeah.
And it was rough. I mean, I not to lie to you, I loved coming to work every day. I loved the business that I was in. Basically, I was in the same business that I had worked for under the other gentleman. I loved getting to fly, but financially, it was just hand to mouth. I mean, a little bit of money would come in, it would go out. We'd get a little leg up, 1 month, and then we'd have extra expenditures or some surprise the next month. That was really stressful, and we were, we used a term in entrepreneurial talk called bootstrapping. Man, we were bootstrapping to the 10th degree. There were times where I literally made, which isn't, I'm not advocating it. It's just the reality. There at least 2 or 3 times I made payroll with my MasterCard.
Yeah.
That's not good. That's not the way that's not in anybody's business plan, But we were survivors, and I really wanted it, and we just kept grinding every day. One of the best pieces of advice that I ever got was from, about in that first 4 years that were so difficult for us. My dad had a buddy that had a small electrical firm that he had met, and brought him out to do some electrical work on our first leased building that we had. And the guy said, "Neil, one of the things you got to understand is if you want to be successful, you got to keep showing up to work. You got to keep showing up every day, and eventually you're going to make a little bit of extra money, and you're going to want to go buy a new boat and start playing around at the lake." This guy was a real old school kind of a crotchety guy. Or you're going to want to buy a new 4-wheel drive truck and go camping 4 days every weekend. He said, those guys don't make it. If you want to make it, you got to keep showing up to work. And as simple as that was, it just really resonated with me. And every time I'd start to, especially in those early years when every customer counted, every deposit counted, when I would get tempted to go, hey, nobody can tell me to go. I'm going to go play around, or we're going to take a few days off. I would hear his voice in the back of my head, dude, you better get back out there and take care of your business. And
I think that's so wise, and that's a teachable moment, not just for us business owners and entrepreneurs, but our athletes, right? Is we have those conversations relating it to the big leagues. Is you put in so much work to get there, and all of a sudden you're on a MLB roster, you're on an NFL roster, you're in the NBA. To stay there and actually have sustained success, though, is a whole different game, and it's that showing up. It's not believing you've arrived. Is it, you made a comment of overvaluing yourself to the organization, of going, even when times are good. I think there was such, probably for you, I imagine, a teachable moment too in your previous employer, that when he went under, it was actually good. It was just he was over leveraged, and so if you start spending everything that comes in, or getting overextended and kind of counting your chickens before they hatch, is you can get in a lot of trouble. And I see that with a lot of our athletes and how they spend money. Is I'm starting to play good. Now all of a sudden, I could probably really afford a $400,000 home, but I see this contract that's coming. I see this multi-million-dollar contract. I'm going to buy a multi-million-dollar home. And you've now exposed yourself. Whereas, no, I'm just going to continue to show up to work overtime and do the fundamentals. And then, I think the really other interesting thing of your experience that we learn is there's this whole generation of the entrepreneur that wants to go raise money. Everything's about, and hear me, like venture capital and seed money and all that stuff's fantastic, but those that take that money miss the lessons, like you said, of that literally we make a paycheck, we're feeding mouths. It's not a prescriptive thing. We don't want people to starting businesses on MasterCards, but every dollar probably meant something a lot more to you than somebody who's raising millions of dollars. And talk a little bit about just your experience being an employee of companies, how that's made you approach having, I think you had mentioned you're just over 30 employees now. So here you are, not only owning a company 25 years later and going up and down and overall being very successful. Is how did your experience as employee shape you of the way that you treat your employees?
Well, it was, everything that happens to you as an employee, and for the first 16 to 30, so 14 years of my working in the aviation field, I was an employee, and a lot of that went into conscious thought, of how I was going to set up our employee network. A lot of that was because of lessons I learned on how I wanted our company to be, good things that had happened to me as an employee, and how the things I didn't want to repeat because they were negative. So I think that had a lot to do with it, and I realized one of the things that was so shocking to me is I had spent so many years prior to starting Quantum Helicopters as an employee. Probably the biggest shock to me was when I really became the owner. How much I thought I knew that I didn't know. I mean, I was. Like I say, my at the previous company I'd worked at, I was the owner's right-hand man, and I was the chief pilot and the chief instructor, and I had been there for a long time, and I thought I knew how the wheels turned, and I had no idea of a lot of the things that he was doing, like taxes and accountants and dealing with bankers and just dealing with state agencies and federal agencies that some of them I'd never heard of. Well, that was part of running a business that I had never done. And that affects the way I treat my employees now, because sometimes when you have an employee that is struggling or is not understanding why you do things the way you do, or you have to remember that most employees, like I was, all employees, all of us have been employees usually at one time, but a lot of folks have never been owners. So how can you really expect them to understand unless you communicate to them? You know, you make this decision, and sometimes, you know, decisions have to be made and the owner has to be the owner. But a lot of times, a little bit of explanation, a little bit of communication to your employees, you say, you know, why do we do it this way? Or why can't I do it my way? Or why can't we change? And a lot of times a simple explanation will put that fire out, because they haven't been in that spot. Just like I was so humbled when I first actually became the owner and all this stuff started coming at me. I said, oh my gosh, my old boss was doing a whole lot of things and managing a whole lot of things that I had no clue about. So, and then, you know, personality is a lot of what goes into how you treat your employees, and I, you know, education. You know, once I did start our own company and I had the chance. I mean, I did start trying to read and books and periodicals and things having to do with being an entrepreneur, and some of that was constructive to help me know how to, you know, all of a sudden, you know, people are dependent on you, and the decisions that you make affect what they're doing, their careers and their lives. But I think the biggest single factor, and I don't know, my employees might, you know, I always wonder, people ask you questions like that, I wonder if my employees would agree with this, but one of the things that I think that I've been blessed with is I just really have always liked people, you know. And if you, my mantra has always been, listen, I am working long hours and I'm doing the best I can before God to meet my dreams and to be successful and balance my business life, keep the bills paid, make some profit. If I want to do that, I have to be. I would be kind of a low life if I didn't try to promote that amongst the people that are working for me too. Well, I would be a kind of a loser if I didn't want the best for my employees. And when you have that mentality and you want them to succeed, and that's one of the coolest things about our business. It just so happens that, you know, we're a training organization by nature. The bread and butter of our business is helicopter flight training, and we had students literally from all over the world and from all parts of America, and we get to watch them come in, and they all sit in the office and they have no experience and they have a dream just like I did, and you watch them progress from that through their first 2 or 3 ratings, and then they become commercial pilots, and then they become instructors, and then you get to see them transform into being out there flying and working with real customers. And then they move on in their career and do bigger and better things. Many of our graduates now, over the last 25 years, are out running companies, either their own companies or, you know, they're the managers or chief pilots for other companies or positions of authority. And that's really, really satisfying to be able to see people move up the ladder and meet their dreams along with, you know, that was a product of us trying to chase after our dream. So being in the training business like we are, we probably get to enjoy that more than most. And it's just, you know, it's kind of like you just feel like a proud father almost to a lot of these kids that have come through. I can say kids now because I'm getting old, but no disrespect. I mean, they're just usually, when we see them in the beginning, you know, they're 20 to 30 something. Usually this is their first professional endeavor, you know, where people expect you to sit up straight, and, you know, the helicopter business is a dangerous business, so it has to be done right. You know, the customer isn't always right in this business. You have to follow the protocols that keep everybody safe, and so we see them go from that into being very successful in this field, and that is really gratifying.
Yeah, I can only imagine. It's fun to hear you talk about it, because hearing you at 30 years old, 3 little kids, a wife, building a home, of not even really knowing what you're starting, you know, right. Doing some basic training of going, hey, we've got some customers that were kind of left over that hopefully we're going to start, to that fear of, you know, I think to the testament of how you do treat people is that to hear your chief mechanic's been with you 25 years or your chief pilot's been with you for 20 years is they obviously caught a vision. And I loved what you had said. The only promise you said is if I tell you I'm going to do something, if you pay for an hour, you're going to get an hour. And something so simple of just doing what you say you're going to do.
Right.
That should not be extraordinary in this world, but the integrity that people can rely on. And I just think of here we are in Chandler, Arizona, right? We're not in some exciting, state or city, but to now look on it and go, you started there and now you guys have a specialized program with a Chinese, agency that you're training people and going over there. I was reading online, you guys have partnered with, rescuing people and providing an opportunity for ex-military to come in and do some training.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit of all the cool things that you guys are doing here and just how did you, and it's 25 years of how you got there, but you're not coming out with an MBA in marketing and in business and entrepreneurship. And it's like, you started as a kid with a passion for helicopters and aviation, and you've now built a company, right? Like, how does that happen?
Well, again, back to the passion thing. I think my biggest motivator was the passion I had. First of all, I just love helicopters, man, and I still do. I'm 56 years old, and if somebody says let's go flying, I really do. I love that, and when I had the chance, and my old boss when I was in high school, I was telling you about, really set that tone when I started seeing him be able to be a business owner, but at the same time have 50% of his responsibility to flying and 50% running the business. To me, and I had no training, no formal training at all. I barely made it through high school. And I don't advocate that. I just wasn't very academic.
Yeah.
I was bored in school. I made it through high school and graduated, but I had no desire, unless I absolutely had to go to college, which my kids all threw up at me later. They used to love to, when I was telling them, you are going to college.
Yeah.
They're all like, you didn't go to college. I mean, I don't advocate that. Just for me, it was the right thing because I was so involved and interested in what I was doing that was the big thing. I was driven by the passion. First of all, the love of helicopters. Second of all, the seed that got planted in my head that, man, you could be an entrepreneur. You could be, his name was Bob. You could be Bob,
Right.
And you could be flying and running the business, and I didn't know how that would look exactly. And then, lo and behold, over many years, it kind of worked out. And the cool things we've been able to do, our bread and butter really is the flight training. But the flight training business, because we use the Robinson helicopters for our flight training platform, it was a natural fit for us to become a Robinson dealer. And over the years, we kind of have hitched our cart to this Robinson product, which has been wildly successful. Mr. Robinson and the Robinson Helicopter Company, really, they are like he is the Henry Ford of the helicopter business. He changed the entire industry, and my timing, I couldn't have planned that, but I got in on the early years of that. So we became a dealer. That was a natural outgrowth of what we were flying to do the flight training. And now they produce not only the small training aircraft, but two bigger aircraft, and now they produce a turbine or a jet helicopter. So we do dealership sales, and because of the dealership sales and selling helicopters to businesses and individuals, that kind of got us into the maintenance aspect of maintaining aircraft. So, we talked a little bit earlier about, of all the mistakes I made and of all of the second steps I had to repeat, and in my learning process, one thing that really got a hold of me after the experience of my old boss that was in the training business going under is, man, I realized at 30 years old, if I was going to jump in this pool and try to build something, I was very equity minded. I wanted to the maximum extent possible. I wanted my energy and my time and my money going into things that were going to count for something later. And I realized, hey, I'm 30 years old. If I'm going to do this 20 or 25 more years or 30, whatever, I want to have something at the end to show for it. You know, I want to have some kind of build something that's worth something, and not just go after the glamour. Which in our business we have a lot of glamour. You know, we have a lot of people doing things because they're cool and they look good, and they never really build any equity. They're leasing and they don't have a long-term plan. So because of all those reasons, and we set the business up as this flight school that also runs its own maintenance operation. We don't farm any of that out. We started with one professional maintenance person, and now that's grown into, I think we've got 6 or 7 of them now that work here full time. We don't farm that out to anybody else. That the sales operation led to us meeting some of the most interesting people in aviation, and so it's really cool. We, on a daily basis, we might be working with well, I had one in here yesterday, literally just yesterday, a 17-year-old young man that has started, he drives one of our vans that run our customers back and forth to the apartments. He's 17 years old, works his butt off, hardworking, respectful young man, old school kind of, and he comes in and says, Neil, I want to learn how to fly. I mean, this is what I want to do, you know. And I'm like, wow, this is deja vu. Yeah. You know, I mean, so I said, pull up a chair. And I'm going to tell you the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so from that, you know, he told me what he wants to do. I told him, you know, here's what I would do, and we need to get your mom and dad in here and talk to them if they're going to support you. So we have everything from that, a young man who's going to have to do just like I did, work his butt off and maybe get a couple small loans, you know, to literal on the buying and training side, guys that are buying helicopters, billionaires, you know, guys that have developed humongous companies and have been very successful and have been attracted to our business because they want to fly helicopters, they want to own them. So we have all of that spectrum and everything in between: police departments, fire departments, government agencies. We have we did some training for the Israeli Air Force at one point. Wow. Because of a weird situation they had. You know, we had to give training to this guy that was just a stud, man. He was a colonel in the Israeli Air Force, but because he didn't have an American certificate, he had to come here to get training. I'm like, dude, you should be training me. Yeah. I mean, this guy was an Apache fighter pilot in the Israeli Air Force. So we've done that. I mean, and the list just goes on and on. Heads of big corporations, entrepreneurial leaders that have built up companies, you know, and purchased helicopters, and I find them all fascinating. I mean, I don't say this to be falsely humble or PC or any of that. I'm not very PC, but it really is the truth. I find it just as satisfying to work with the 17-year-old kid who's just trying to get started and wants somebody to tell him the truth, and who has a dream, because I identify with that so much, as the billionaire, you know, who's flying his private jet in so that he can look at a helicopter, you know. All of those people and everybody in between, I've just learned to have a deep, deep appreciation for anybody who's a customer. You know, that's just, like you said, Eric, so many of these things are so simple, you know. People just want you to do what you say you're going to do. But how many times does that not happen in business? Yeah. People just want you to appreciate them as an employee or as a customer. Man, that's right out of anybody can write that business manual. But how many people get caught up in the day-to-day grind and they forget those simple things? I mean, the years that we had to work so hard to find a customer has made me now, and I'm always telling our staff, you know, and they're really good about it. I have the best staff in the world, and most of them, like you said, have been with me a long time. But once in a while we have to revisit. They all tease me because I call it, again, I don't know what else to call it. I call it niceness training. I say, you guys are going to get your butts in here. We're going to do some niceness training, because you get in the grind and you get under the stress and crossing the T's and dotting the I's. Don't forget, without the customer sometimes they frustrate you. We all know. We've all been customers and we've all frustrated people. Yeah. Sometimes the customers don't understand, but man, they are the lifeblood. Without the customers, you don't have anything. You don't get to do anything or develop so we really have tried to stress that over the years, and I think that's been good for us too. We appreciate them all.
Yeah. Well, powerful stuff. Transitioning a little bit to, okay, you're a business owner, you've tasted some success. Talk about your decision of how you've balanced personal life and being a business owner. I think you said something really key of you had some goals of what you wanted life to look like with some balance. And that's a big question that comes, whether it's really anybody pursuing mastery in anything that they love, is they can give themselves wholly to one thing, and unfortunately we'll see it train wreck some other aspects of life. How have you combated that? What advice would you have for people that are in that grind?
Well, and first of all, I'll say I'm not sure I figured it out. And Robbie and I have talked about this a little bit. That's a constant struggle, the balance of the work life versus the family life versus I am a devout Christian, so that part of my life is important to me. How do I balance all these things? And I'm not sure that I've got it figured out, but I know that one of the things that has been really good for me is that the helicopter business, like I said earlier, is local. So, in many of the other aviation jobs, airline pilots and charter pilots, jet, you're traveling all the time. And one thing that was good for us is I knew I was always going to be in my own bed at night. It was with the exception of occasional travel. It's always I was going to be home at night. And in the early years of starting our business, I struggled with the balance more because it just is more demanding, and I had, and I wasn't horrible. It wasn't like I was working 20 hours a day and never seeing my kids, but I had an epiphany when my daughter, my oldest child is a daughter, Taylor, and when she was 5 years old, it just hit me one day as we were grinding and churning, and this was right during the time we were trying to get our business off the ground, no pun intended. And I realized that other than a couple little weekend trips, I had never taken my daughter on vacation. She'd been on vacation with her grandparents, and she was 5 years old. And this was during the period we were still struggling. And I just went home. I told my wife, I said, look, I don't care what it takes. I don't care how low-key. We are going on vacation. Mm-hmm. And that was one of the best vacations we ever had. As a young family, it was an epiphany to me. It woke me up to the fact that, and I was never sloppy. I always knew, people are always telling you time goes by so fast. You mentioned you have a 3-year-old daughter. Yeah. I would say the same to you. You won't believe how fast it's going to be that she's going to be off to college. You just, until you've lived that, you can't believe how fast that's going to happen. So I was always cognizant of that, but the things happened the way they did. We're working like crazy. You have to try to balance it, and that was a big turning point for me. At that point that Taylor was 5 years old, I said, okay, I've got to do better at this. Whether we're going to make it or we're not, I have to do a better job. And I really consciously started working on it. For example, this is very unusual in my business, but we close every Sunday. We are closed to the extent that if you get caught working here, you might get fired. If you come in on Sunday, you might, because that isn't really, it's not a religious thing for me. It is we wanted one day that all of our employees could know that day you're off. You don't have to. Nobody's going to call you in. There's going to be no emergency thing. So that and that was healthy for me too, to know that at least that one day we're not going to do it. And then it's just a matter of continuously reminding yourself. And my wife helps me with that. My wife was my high school sweetheart. We have that advantage too. We started dating in our senior year, and we kind of grew up together. So I can tell when I'm pushing the limits just by, even if she doesn't say anything, hey, Jennifer, I got to go to work today. Well, that's the last 2 or 3 Saturdays you've been at work. She doesn't even have to say it. I know, okay, I'm getting out of balance here. I need to. And a lot of times that if there is a negative about passion, you guys know from your business, if there's a negative about it, it's because since the day I was 16 years old, I have never gotten out of bed dreading going to work. And we have customers we work with that, oh my gosh, I can't wait till Friday. It's like, or you hear people talking about hump day. I don't. We got over the hump. So I've never experienced that. I've loved even the jobs I had that were crappy jobs. I loved doing them at that time in my life. And everybody's got everybody has days you have to do things you don't want to do.
Of course.
Those days you don't look forward to. But in general, I've always enjoyed coming to work, and I've recognized, especially in the last 10 years or so, sometimes I go to work because I want to, because I enjoy being at work, and I don't have to be at work. I could take this time and I could go do one of these other priorities in my life. That's a matter of choice now. Yeah. It isn't because I got to pay the bills this week, and man, I got to go down there and grind out some more production.
Right.
It's because I love what I'm doing. Yeah. If there's anything negative to the passion, that might be it. And sometimes you have to say, okay, like watching too much TV or watching too much baseball or whatever. Yeah. You got to stop and put the priorities in line. But I think it's a lifelong thing. I don't think it ever. Yeah. Like even as you asked me the question, I'm sitting here, my mind is turning. I'm thinking, the last month or so, I haven't done so great.
Yeah. But I think what I love hearing about this, and this resonates with a lot of entrepreneurs and business owners, is having the right view of work too. Is this should be something we get excited about, and it is fun. I mean, we were laughing on the hump day conversation because that drives me absolutely bonkers. It pisses me off because it's like, then why are you going there? And I get it's a privileged conversation for a lot of, we're very blessed to be able to wake up and do things. But if you're listening to this podcast, you're most likely in a position that if you hate your job and you can't get over Wednesday, you need to go figure out what your passion is and do something else and realize, it's going to be a sacrifice. You don't get to make $100,000 and do everything you love at the age of 25, right? Like right. Zuckerberg does. That's about it, And I just think that it's really important to go find something you're passionate about, work, and it will give you the options when you're older to be able to do what you said, is to say, hey, I can wake up and I am going to go into the office. I don't have to, but I want to, And I just think of legacy, and what you've built here is really cool is, I can think of this is something that's going to last beyond your name, which has got to be something you're so proud of, is to go, this wasn't an ego build, right. And I just think that's really amazing. When we were talking over lunch, one of the things you had mentioned before we even had pulled into the restaurant I thought was funny is you're now in a situation, it's why we're sitting here doing this interview, is there's been some recognized success, and you've conducted yourself in a way that younger guys, even though we think Robbie's old at our company, respect you, and they start to come to you and ask business advice or even ask you to invest in them. How do you think about, and I think this is really important for business owners and athletes who have money, to think, like, how do you just think about money, and how do you think about investing?
That's a timely question. As I'm getting older and, I'm not ready to fly off into the sunset yet, but you start thinking about those things, It's different than when you're starting. And I have always just been very conservative, and some of that is because as I observed over these years of working for other people and then starting our business and meeting so many successful business people, for me, from my personality and the way that I want to do things, I know that there are different ideologies on leveraging credit, and you hear terms like good debt and bad debt, and what I noticed is the guys that I really looked up to and the people that I thought were the most successful and were the most comfortable in their financial situation were the pretty much exclusively the cash or king guys, the guys that bootstrapped. And I mean, we've been able to work with in the helicopter field, teaching some people that started from very humble beginnings and built humongous companies, far, far bigger than I'll ever build. And those guys were just wonderful resources for me. But when you listen to them talk and tell their stories, they were pretty old school business guys. They bootstrapped, they worked, they reinvested, they built equity in their companies, and they all had big paydays at the end. That influenced me, and I'm not, again, I had no formal business training. I read a lot and I researched and I talked to a lot of people. So I'm not saying that my way is the best for everybody, but I knew for me what I needed to do was to try to build a business that at whatever level was going to be worth something, and that could either be sold or could continue into our family and be run by one of my kids or somebody, so that was the biggest thing for me. Now, as I sit here, one of the things I've recognized in recent years is my lack, and I'm always throwing little questions at Robbie because I have no investment knowledge, and I'm an old school. I have no stock market. I have not invested in the stock market because everything that I've done for 25 years has been reinvested into my own company.
Right.
I know exactly what the returns are in my company.
Right.
I know exactly how to leverage my my equity and the machines that we use, how to best write them off and gain the tax benefits from them, and I'm very comfortable with that. But now I'm recognizing that someday I am going to. I can't do this forever. I'm hopefully, God willing, I'm going to sell out, or and when that happens, I'm going to have to transition to my money working for me.
Yeah.
And I am nervous about that because I don't have any skill set of that. I've done I've done side businesses and things that I've kind of been hobbies for us. But when it comes time for me to, if you use the word that financial planners like you guys always use, portfolio. Yeah. I mean, my only portfolio has been a bunch of helicopters, Yeah. So now when those are gone and it's time for me to let the money work, that's something I'm going to have to get help with. I mean, I recognize that I'm going to have to go out and try to find some people like you guys that I trust, or somebody who can help me figure out how to responsibly do that, so I'm not out of money in 5 years. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think I know this is resonating with our athletes, right? Because I think this is just true whether you're an athlete or you're a business owner, is you've reinvested into what you know, and it has been the best investment. It's funny, I was going to ask you later, but we can even do it now, is we always ask that question, what's the one best or most worthwhile investment you've made? It could be time, money, resources, and every single business owner, my own business, of course,
right.
And so I think that's a really natural thing. But where I would say you're a step ahead, where most of our athletes or find themselves, is the music stops and there's been no thought whatsoever. And so just even that intentionality, and it's scary for the audience. We recognize it, that I've done this my whole life, and now, okay, I'm being rewarded for the work I've done, but now there's this whole next phase of life. I'm going to have to trust people. It's an area that I don't understand. The financial world has not been friendly to consumers, as we joked around of the famous book, Where's the Customer's Yachts? And so I think it's it's a scary place, I think, for the audience to be, but, clearly you're already starting to think about it and thinking that way. One of the things you said in the car, though, about investing that I thought was great is when people come to you with ideas. Can you share with the audience of how those conversations go, and what kind of advice would you give to someone who's starting a business?
Well, I think what we were talking about in the car, somehow or another we got on to, I don't remember, investment advice or something, and I made the comment that, from time to time we have people come to us that want us to either invest in their idea, or they say they've got an idea. A lot of those things are aviation oriented, so they're looking for advice or financial assistance. And one of the things I've always learned, which is, again, sounds very simplistic, but to me it's an important question. I usually say, well, you've laid out your idea, and I see your passion for the idea, and it could be, very relevant. But do you have any customers yet? Have you run this by anybody who's a potential customer? And can you sign up one person? That's a real litmus test to me. As a marketing research thing, to run your idea by some people who may actually be customers and see if anybody jumps with the checkbook.
Yeah.
And in most cases, the answer was, well, no, I never thought about that, or no, well, nobody's offered to pay me for this product or good or service.
Right.
And that's a bad sign. Some folks have said, yeah, that's a great idea, and I need to go pursue that. I need to go talk to some real, because, again, business is so, it requires customers, or you don't have a business, you have a hobby.
Yeah.
And that's okay to have a hobby, but you have to be honest enough to say this is a hobby.
Right.
It costs money, it doesn't make money. And so yeah, that's what I was talking about in the car, and it is very simple, but it's a very wise way to approach it, I think. And what was the other part of the question? I forgot.
So, I love that advice. It's the minimum viable product, right? Of going, even as an investor, as I think of the angel investments or venture capital that we or our clients do, is if you can actually come with proof of concept and you show sales, it's a much more interesting deal. And you're not going to have to give up as much of your business to get somebody else's capital. So I think that's just a very wise thing to say. My second question was just, you've over the years obviously read a lot of books and periodicals and journals to become the business owner that you are. What resources would you point people to who are trying to start businesses? You had mentioned, maybe Rich Dad, Poor Dad for learning. Are there any books or anything that pops out to you of that you'd say, hey, these are the resources that I would go to?
Well, interestingly enough, the gentleman that was the Dodgers general manager, what was his name?
Fred Clare.
Fred. He mentioned in From Good to Great.
Yeah.
And it's been years ago, but I read that book and enjoyed it very much. And the idea behind the hedgehog concept, he brought that up in his podcast. I have read almost everything that Robert Kiyosaki has written, because a lot of it really resonated with me, but not all of it. He's a leverage guy, use other people's money. That part of it I could never really feel comfortable with. And of course he's a much more accomplished businessman than I am. So I'm not criticizing that, but I took a lot of advice from his books, and I advise especially younger people who have this idea, and I said, hey, have you ever, if you think that this area of business or this particular business idea might have validity, have you tried it, or have you go to work for somebody? I just was talking with a young lady that has some ideas in another field away from aviation, and I said to her, hey, if you believe that you might want to own that type of business someday, go get a job and work there for a year. You're at a place in your life that you can do that. You're unencumbered, you're not married, you're not having to grind out a mortgage payment or anything. Do it now before it's too late. And that, like we talked about, you mentioned before, in our previous conversation, where a lot of people, we see some of this in our business, people that are coming here with the idea of retraining, or a lot of people don't intend it to be that way, but they get trapped in a lifestyle or a job or a set of payments and a set of obligations that make it really difficult to get out. That's another thing that I try to really, if somebody's really wanting to start a business, you can't lie to them. You got to tell them there are exceptions to the rule, and people that, all of a sudden they put something on the market, or they open their doors and they're instantly making money. That's not, in my experience with all the entrepreneurs I've known, that's not the normal thing. It's a long road. I always try to be honest with people about that, but I also let them know, hey, it's a long road, but nothing. If you're meant to be that person, you're meant to do the entrepreneurial thing and run a company or be your own boss. There's nothing. I wouldn't trade it for the world. Knowing everything I know, I would do the same thing over again. Not even think about it.
Yeah, I think just a book that comes to mind is The Lean Startup. Talks about the ramen budget. It's probably the hardest thing for our generation in our consumeristic society today to forego the instant gratification. But it is the less obligations you have in the short term, the more freedom you have to build your business quicker and without the stress, is when, and this is just true of, I think, our athletes. This is a lot of the advice we give, whether it's our business owner clients, entrepreneurs, athletes, is when you start to create this lifestyle, like, until your money is working enough for you that you don't have to work, you don't have true freedom. Right? And the beautiful thing about that number is you control it, so instead of putting yourself under this stress where it's like, I have to do these things that I don't enjoy to keep up a lifestyle that Will Smith famously says you're maintaining to impress people you don't like anyways, is control your expenses now and then enjoy those benefits if the business goes well. And if it doesn't, then you have flexibility to move on. Yeah. So I think that's really wise. Being sensitive on time, kind of the final question that we always ask is, so our podcast kind of tagline is master your money, your business. But then the third part, and I think this is by far the most critical, is your life. Is business is great. I think there's a ton of intrinsic value to what we do as businesses, but money's just a tool. Money's a tool to hopefully live life successfully, for whatever that means for individuals. Is just posing that question to you is kind of when you think at the end of your life looking back, if people said, all right, Neil, you've been successful, what's that mean to you at the end of life?
Well, success to me would be, and again, not to get preachy or anything, but being a devout follower of Christ, that is the first thing to me. That is where the game is won and lost. Have I been successful in that? In not that we're all going to make mistakes and we're all going to have regrets, but have I been true to my Savior? And I'm a real family person, so we have a very tight-knit family, and I now have my first couple grandkids. So another part of my definition of success is, have I done everything I can do to bolster them in that tradition, to leave them with that heritage, and to be an example to them. I feel the pressure, and you guys are younger fathers, so you're going to feel, I mean, you already feel it, but as the kids get older, the pressure, you feel the pressure of being a mentor to your own children, and those are the most important people in your life, you know, your wife and your kids, and now the grandkids. Oh my gosh, is a whole nother level. I mean, I always knew I would really love being a grandfather, but I never had an idea that it would be this special. So that's a big part of, if there's a legacy or a success to my life, is you know, when I'm gone, that my kids and my grandkids and the people that we've worked with, you know, our customers, feel like that, you know, you dealt with them with integrity, and you were who you said you were. And I mean, again, not that anybody's perfect. I mean, I have, you know, every father looks back. My kids are all adults now, and I look back and say, man, I wish I would have done this a little different or that a little different. You know, we all do the best we can, but that is a big part of my success. And then, yes, I do want to. I want to make sure that if I pass before my wife goes, that she's taken care of. You know, and is that sexist? No, not in my opinion. It's not sexist. It's me taking care of my family.
Yeah.
I want to make sure that I have financially planned to the point that if I go first, that she's taken care of through her natural life, and that, God willing, we leave some inheritance for our kids and for my grandkids, especially my grandkids. I just told Parker, my son, the other day, I said, dude, I wish I could have just skipped you and gone right to my grandkids. But and I hope to have many more of those before I pass on, you know, many more grandkids. So that all is part of the success. That's the real legacy. That's the serious part of it. Here's the fun part for me. At this age, at 56 years old, just getting into the grandparent thing, what at this point in our business, now that we have somewhat made it, and we don't have the pressures we had in the early years, the neatest thing about being a business owner and having being in the black instead of the red, like we were in, is that you do have some more freedom, and you can enjoy time with your kids and your family, and you can invest in their futures. You know, you can start to set up the things, you know, the college funds and the educational things for your kids and your grandkids, and help them in ways that, you know, that we probably never would have been if I would have continued working for other people.
Yeah.
That today is the fun stuff. You know, that's what makes it so satisfying. And you know, we still all have to have a healthy fear. I mean, I still, and it's a healthy fear. You don't want to go too far, but you still have to. There's no such thing as making it permanently.
Yes.
You know, I'm still constantly aware of what is the industry doing? What are our competitors doing? You know, it would be easy to go on autopilot, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really dangerous thing for people that get towards the end of their career.
Yeah.
You start thinking about, or you get out and start having so much fun that you start not paying attention to the details, or letting other people, you know, do everything for you. I think entrepreneurs have to be very careful of that too. But like I said, all in all, we've had real struggles at times during our journey as business owners, my wife and I, but man, I wouldn't trade it for the world. For those that are listening, you know, and if you've got that gene, you know,
yeah.
There's nothing else that's going to satisfy you, you know, if you've got the entrepreneurial gene. So I wouldn't trade it for the world, even if, you know, a lot of entrepreneurs try things and they're not always successful every time. You know, I look up to those people, serial entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
You know, I guess I'm an entrepreneur, but I'm just a helicopter guy. I knew one thing, right? I really respect the people that can go from business to business because they're business people.
Yeah.
You know, that's a skill that's beyond what I've done. So anyway, I wouldn't trade it for the world.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for the time. This has been
You're welcome.
a lot of fun, and I know I took a lot away from it. And
Well, I got to tell you, you're good at this, man. You're going to be a late night. There's a late night host in your future or something.
Yeah, we'll see. It's
you're a professional.
Behind a camera and a microphone, we like to have a little fun, right?
Yeah,
but,
exactly.
Thank you so much. We've enjoyed it, and for our audience, I'll put all of the books or references in the show notes. If you guys want to learn more about quantum helicopters, we'll make sure that the information's in there. And please leave comments, feedback, anything that you have for us, and tune in next week for another episode of the Athlete CEO Podcast.